The ideas that gave birth to our nation are the ideas that our nation is resistant to right now, and we should talk about that all the time.
In a world where narratives are shaped by corporations and gatekeepers, independent voices matter more than ever. Badlands Media brings together citizen journalists, researchers, and independent thinkers.
The truth is triggering.
Question the narrative. Explore the facts.
It's authenticity, courage, resilience.
Search for the truth others won't.
It's not about being first or being right.
The information war is changing.
It's about being authentic.
Embrace the friction.
Embrace the friction.
Shut the up.
Authentically antagonizing. Join the movement.
I'm going to say how I feel.
Follow Badlands Media.
This is about the future.
The Badlands. What are the Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Hey, welcome everybody to this week's episode of Breaking Free of Psyops, and I am your host, Matthew Ehret, and today we're going to be continuing a certain journey into history, but also into the future at the same time. Imagine that. And that's usually how it works, since those who were making history were also doing it in such a way, if they were being effective, by thinking about futures that they wanted to bring into being. Now, sometimes those futures were good and laudable and natural. Other times they were horrific, based really upon the ideas, what ideas you hold about the nature of human beings, about the nature of love, of justice, of God, the creator of all. And, I was giving this some thought. If you're born into an oligarchical caste, there's a lot working against you in general. There's, you might have affluence, hereditary power, property, unnaturally ungodly amounts of property and of stocks that you've inherited from a continuous legacy, but you've also got a tradition that you were born into that is designed to break your humanity, that is designed to try to bring out the worst possible version of you in the course of a series of experiences that you will get in your formative years, which should be normally spent being given hugs and love and play by a loving family environment. You don't get any of that. You get a boarding school that's designed to break you. You get coldness where you should have love in a family unit. You don't get a family unit. And ultimately you have occult mystery schools with esoteric inner unnatural teachings that you are going to be expected to be initiated into as you will be granted ever more privileges and controls over the management of government, the management of society, which requires that you be broken of your humanity, of your compassion, of those fundamental things that really make you human, in order for you to have access to the type of responsibilities you will be expected to act. So it's very sad. It's very sad in so many ways. Because, I'd like to think that these oligarchs could have been great. They could have been great people. As babies, they were born as babies, thus good, or at least with an orientation towards goodness. And that was kept from them. So, pity them, pity the fools, as a wise man once said. But today, I'm going to be dealing, as people have noticed who have read the title of today's presentation, on the Khazarian question, the Khazars. And I'm going to be doing this because last week I dealt with a class with a guest named Mike King. I thought it was a very good class, a good interview. And Mike had done a lot of work on these ancient families, these higher bloodlines that have maintained a continuous, unbroken system of tradition, a very unnatural tradition that have utilized in the last millennium, especially chivalric orders to express their powers, patronized by royal families, the royal houses of Europe, which go back a very long ways to the patrician class of the Roman Empire and earlier still. And we went through a lot of that. He brought in the Templars. He brought in the various, the Order of Montesa, the Order of Jesus Christ, which is a Neo-Templar order established just a few years after the Templars were taken down in France and in England and in Germany. and they had emerged in Portugal. They had reemerged in Scotland under the various occult networks that were tied to druidic orders that had gone underground, but had always remained a very influential system of controls that organized witch covens. Of course, it wasn't witch covens of the ancient pagan times. It took on a new form of Black Madonna worship, which was a cover for Isis. The Black Madonna figure, if people Google that, they will find a strange, robust history of the Black Madonna phenomenon, which served also as a double for Mary, the ambiguous name for Mary, as well as Mary Magdalene, two Holy Marys within the Bible, one a mother, an untainted motherly figure of the deity, right? The other one being the whore, right? The whore mythology. Even though there's nowhere in the Bible that Mary Magdalene is even called a whore. That's something that only emerged in like the 15th century by the edicts of a certain pope, a ne'er-do-well pope, that said, oh yeah, she was a whore. There's actually no evidence anywhere in the Bible that she was a whore. But that being said, the image, the gossip, the story that she was created a very convenient ambiguity of the convergence of the Madonna and the whore, right? The two opposing aspects of the female persona that became a part of the sacred feminine, the secret sacred feminine that maintained a continuity around the worship of certain Templars, earlier Mithraic initiates, earlier Sibylline, Sibyl cultists of the Roman Empire, and their Galli hierophants, and like I said, Isis and the Isis cults that generated centuries and centuries of doped up, drugged up, sexed up assassins, leading all the way up to the anarchist communes and cults of the 19th and early 20th centuries, I would say even still to this very day. So there's a lot of rich history there. And, you know, Mike and I went through elements of this. We went through the Crusades, the use of Jewish mercenary families that were recruited from amongst especially Sephardic families originally during the Middle Ages, during the Crusades, to be the bankers of the higher elites, the higher royalties that would then utilize their services as usurers to carry out economic warfare against all Christian, other Jews, Muslim alike. And that was sort of how this tradition of the Hofjuden, as it became known, of the Rothschilds, of the Montefiore's and other things, became known. But now here's the thing. I did notice that there's a lot of support. A lot of people appreciated that show. But a lot of people were also very, a lot of people were writing to me saying that I was being duplicitous. I was running cover for the Jews, that I've even had many people call me a crypto Jew because I'm saying that there's a higher power. I'm not saying that the Rothschild family is good. I'm not saying that. I never said that. But I am saying that there's a higher power above them, that they are not the end all evil, that there's a higher evil that utilizes these Jewish banking families, these Bronfmans, the Soroses and what have you, from above. And just by going there, I've been labeled a bunch of very, very nasty labels. So we're gonna continue to pull on these threads to see where this leads. Because I gotta say, if you don't understand the Templar control of global banking, of global maritime trade, the creation of the system of piracy that the Templars initiated, that were revived as Mithraic male-only warrior sea cult, which originally penetrated into the Roman Empire before Jesus was even born, under the patronage of Pompey and Julius Caesar. If you don't know that, if you don't know how that rebranded itself to set up this war of civilizations that undid something very special that was going on in the 8th and the 9th and the 10th centuries, if you don't know that, then you won't be able to understand what are the Warburgs, what are these Hofjuden families, what are the Rockefellers, what are the Rothschilds. You won't be able to understand any of this stuff properly. So we're going to continue this. We're going to see where this goes. And I decided to compile a presentation. I added a few elements to something I've already delivered on a few occasions, but I don't think I've ever delivered in this format here on Badlands Media. So we're going to do this today by going at the Khazarians. And of course, a lot of people have very negative feelings today about the Khazarians. I think one of the earliest voices to really shed light or to point our attention towards the evil Khazarian Empire of the the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, of which there's hardly any empirical physical evidence remaining or that have survived the sands of time to this very day. But the person to really focus attention on this in our modern conspiratorial sort of research world was David Icke. I think this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. He brought up the Khazarians as the source of the shape-shifting lizard reptilian entities that have been controlling humanity for so long. Was he telling the truth? Was David Icke, the lizard man, telling the truth? Or was there something else going on? Of course, there was a kingdom called Khazaria. That is true. Of course, it was a Jewish kingdom, or it became a Jewish kingdom in the mid 8th century. That's also true. And it is true that there is very little information about it that has survived. Almost as if there has been a systematic, conscious wiping out of the records, of the memory of what this kingdom was and why it was. And that space of ignorance, that space of lack of evidence has created a lot of room for creative play. The creative imaginations have been able to run wild a little bit, painting very concrete, definitive pictures about the evil of what this is and how this created and how this was the house of the Rothschilds, how this was the home of everything bad in humanity. Okay, so what was it? What was it? So I'm going to just show a presentation here. Let's start this presentation. It's called "The Truth About Khazaria," is what I've called this. And there's a painting there, a 19th century painting, as an homage of a certain alliance that was created, a little known alliance, but I think a very important one, between Christian and Muslim worlds, featuring Harun al-Rashid, the leader of the Abbasid Muslim dynasty that had it as its capital Baghdad, the center of the houses of wisdom. And they were featuring the man with the cross, is one of the emissaries of Charlemagne. Also another emissary is a man on the horse with the funny helmet. And what you have is essentially a dialogue that had taken place, a painting of a dialogue, a very famous dialogue between the emissaries, the embassy of Charlemagne, the leader of the Christian world at that time, and his counterpart Harun al-Rashid. And we're going to say something about this importance. And there's also a Jewish element to this as well, because the leading ambassador who organized this treaty, this alliance between the two worlds, was a Jewish ambassador that Harun al-Rashid had set up in Baghdad, who came up with this clever idea at a time when the Crusades were nearly launched in the early 9th century, when both men, Harun al-Rashid and Charlemagne, were both leaders. And a lot of pressure was being put onto Charlemagne as to basically declare war on the Muslim world, and retake the Holy Land in the name of Jesus. Of course, this would happen 2 centuries later, but it wouldn't happen under Charlemagne because of this brilliant maneuver based on an alliance that was brokered by a particular ambassador named Isaac of Rachen. That is the Jewish ambassador who organized Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid. And I'm going to say more about this soon. But let's look at today. As I said, today's presentation is about the future. Here's an idea of the past and the future playing together in a very interesting way. This is a recent meeting of the leaders of the BRICS Plus nations, Putin, Xi Jinping, al-Sisi, Modi, a variety of other Central Caucasus leaders as well were present. And featured behind them was a Tang Dynasty painting, which was an homage to the Silk Road. And this was a big meeting that was celebrating the revival of the Silk Road that has gotten really off the ground since 2013 as the foundation of foreign policy of China and the foundation of a new type of way of thinking about foreign policy, about self-interest, about economics, about cultural exchange, which isn't so much based upon the idea of might makes right that has been animating so much of the folly and of the corruption of the Western world over the past centuries, but rather was based upon a higher idea. I would think a more successful idea that was once embodied in the best of the American leadership of John F. Kennedy, of Franklin Roosevelt, of Lincoln, and many, many, many others, many of whom were assassinated, which all said that no, our foundation of our self-identity, of our self-interest, is not based upon how much we can screw over the weak and those who might threaten us, but rather how much good we can provide to the world, to our own future, and how much we can create with our neighbors. That idea obviously is not something we've seen in the United States in a very long time, but we have seen a revival of it through the spirit of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is something that was originally, for 400 years, from 200 BC to around 200 AD, the defining policy of international relations that had emanated out of China. Probably has something to do with something that Alexander the Great had done by extending Hellenic civilization from the west into the east about a century before the Silk Road emerged. But that's for future historians to piece together. I'm going to begin mine from the origins of the Silk Road, and it had periodically collapsed and arisen from time to time again. And this current incarnation of it involves 21st century technologies, and again, the same type of philosophy that animated the best of the ancient world, I would say. But of course, certain people will look upon the maps of the Silk Road with its various core arteries, the development corridors that have stretched from China and the east all the way through the Middle East, through Iran, through Baghdad, through Syria, via Turkey into the Mediterranean, into Europe, but also through Russia, as we see in the northern corridor of the Silk Road, as well as the middle corridor. And there's even an unnamed southern corridor that has been proposed, which I don't have sadly on my thing, but that ran through, again, the lower part of Iran to Iraq to Syria and down into Africa. There's images also of the north-south transportation corridor that India, Russia, and Iran had signed on to back in 2001, which has also been sabotaged increasingly by geopolitical maneuvering and shenanigans over the past 4 or 5 years. But it still could come back alive again. And it's certainly something that, if it were permitted to blossom with high-speed rail, new cities, new development corridors, new industrial centers, you could have the foundation of a really positive world of cooperation, where the idea of economics is not so much to steal from others or to blow people up that threaten you or to speculate on debts that don't exist, but rather to build concretely real tangible goods in the real tangible world that both benefit entrepreneurs, that benefit workers, and that also create an uplifting of the standards of living. So imagine that. And here again are just some of the ideas of the Africa Vision 2063, which has been endorsed by China, by Russia, by a number of other Eurasian countries, that call for really a United States of Africa, in a sense, a Pan-Africanism that I think is pretty healthy, founded upon large-scale projects. This particular program calls for 6 east-west rail corridors and 3 north-south corridors. Some of this is already being built that could easily extend into Yemen via the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, featured there on the right, where a rail built by China has already been completed and could extend through the Bab el-Mandeb into Yemen and into the broader Arabian regions. Here is something else that was on the books. It was coming close to manifesting into reality up until the ouster of Bashar al-Assad and the institution of the unfortunate ISIS government of Syria that has now been officially legally recognized by governments around the world for some reason. But this was going to happen, featuring, again, rail and new corridors, industrial centers stretching around all over the Middle East. Was a good idea, and it would have shaped the future in a very positive direction had it not been sabotaged. Of course, this could always come back online, but it's been set back quite a ways. And I mentioned already the ancient Silk Road. Here's the basic pattern of some of the most important corridors of that ancient Silk Road, of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty that got into power after the Qing Dynasty, after the Warring States period was ended by the Qing, that unified for the first time China, which had been formerly something like 6 or 7 different warring states. And when the Qing came about, they lasted for about 20 years. They imposed a unified China, but they did it in a very heavy hand, let's just say, to be polite. It was brutal. It was legalistic. It was brutal. It crushed scholars who were dissident. And it wasn't pretty, but it did unify the state. It did create a form of peace of the grave. And that peace did create a bureaucratic structure that allowed for central government for the first time in centuries. Now, fortunately, the Qing dynasty of legalism was short-lived, and a much healthier philosophy emerged with the overthrow of the Qing and the creation of the Han dynasty that lasted for 400 years. And they immediately had launched the Silk Road foreign policy. And again, it was based upon the idea, the faith that other cultures don't want to kill you. You don't have to kill them, that there's something to learn from other peoples, other cultures, other faiths, and that commerce through spice, through silk, through new science, technology, astronomy, poetry, the arts is a healthy basis of getting to work and expand your neighborhood, expand your sense of self and belonging in a broader world that allows for the recognition of the differences of other religions, of other cultures, but it prizes the idea of our differences. It doesn't see it as a threat. It doesn't root itself in tribalism of the us versus them ignorant ideology, but it still also looks for what is universal. What is the universal character that makes us human first, around which we can have faith and trust in our neighbors, right? That our neighbors might also want a good life for their kids, that they want to have peace rather than war, that they would prefer to have commerce over poverty, right? So that type of spirit is really lacking in today's world. So let's go back now. What's happening at the same time? As this is happening, the Silk Road original idea, you have trade from the Roman Empire. First, it was the Republic that became the Empire, just a little bit before the murder of Jesus. But already you had commerce going through the pre-Muslim Arab world. The Sassanid Empire would soon emerge. The former Persian areas would emerge. But this is an area where trade was happening from China all the way down through the Roman Republic and then Empire. And at around 395, the Roman Empire began to collapse. It was bursting at the seams. And to try to preserve it a little bit longer, to stave off the imminent collapse, it was carved up into two parts, Eastern and Western. The Byzantine grew out of the Eastern Roman Empire in purple, and the Western didn't do so well. That's featured in red. We know that when the Visigoths, when the Ostrogoths, when Alaric began to pillage Rome, starting in 410 AD, and then really peaking in 430 in a series of waves, the Republic broke down, and the smaller, what became known as the Vikings, the Northmen, the different tribes of these Viking pillagers became increasingly powerful as new warlords, new mercenaries, not dissimilar from the type of warring states period that China had gone through before the Han Dynasty for centuries, something similar. And for a period, well, a little over a century, you had the formation of the warring states of Europe, right? There was no real cohesion anymore. The Eastern Byzantine was holding on, but just barely. This is before, again, this map is from 530 AD. This is still before the rise of Islam. The Sassanids were getting very weak, but there were still, the Sassanids was sort of the Zoroastrian new Persian Empire that was, trying to expand their territory while at the same time trying to survive their own internal dissolutions. So the Byzantiums were in a rearguard action, just trying to hold their thing together. Yeah, the Franks emerge as one of a number of these various micro dynasties. We had the Celts and the Picts that, without Roman oversight, were gaining back in influence. The Druids, which had been suppressed by the Romans, were gaining back in influence. A lot of pagan, agencies, some less destructive than others. Some might have been even possibly good. I don't know. But a lot were very destructive, engaged in human sacrifice and pillage. That was very rampant. The Visigoths, like I said, had their jurisdiction in Spain and a big part of the southern what would become later the southern France. Burgundy, Ostrogoths, the Gepids up there just off the Caspian Sea, and what became Khazaria. You had Slavonic tribes that were all pagan in the north in what would become later on Russia. So it was the Vandals, of course, had a big chunk of what was formerly Carthage. And it was just each against all. It was just vying for control. And at a certain point, just like in the Qing dynasty that took control and unified China in 226 BC, the Merovingians were to arise. The Frankish Merovingians. This became the Frankish dynasty. And they were known even before Clovis I, who was sort of the first Christianized Merovingian king. But before him, there were many kings before, starting in 481. And they were able to sort of duke it out and succeed to become the prima inter pares amongst these other various factions. And they kind of unified on a structural level the divided Western Roman Empire, and they created the Merovingian Empire. It was, it would endure in some form or another up until about 751. Although, as we'll see, even as early as the late 7th century, they were already coming apart. So the Sorcerer Kings, I mean, in all evidence, all of the various factions were still being influenced by members of the Roman patrician class, the higher noble families that are still to this very day influencing so much of the Western order. Were back then also, though they had lost a certain degree of influence, and a lot of them had to make an escape or retreat as Rome collapsed. The population of Rome went from 500,000 down to less than 50,000. They lost 90% of their population in a very short period of time when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. A lot of the ruling families had to pick up and move. A lot of them moved to Venice and started reconstituting a new kind of maritime empire, but with a lot of the same kind of traditions that had animated their behavior in Rome. Some of them went to Amalfi, some of them went to Genoa, some of them went to Florence. Some of them just regrouped in Rome, in the center point around the newly forming Catholic Church, which is still just one of several bishoprics of Christendom, right? It wasn't seen originally as though the papacy was anything more than one of the five dominant bishops. It was known as the Bishop of Rome. It wasn't really the universalizing idea of the Vatican as it became later on. But a lot of the empire did find itself regrouping in Rome as well. And they would work together. A lot of the same mystery cult traditions that the inner sanctum of the families operated on would continue to emerge, and they would utilize various members of the Viking hordes that were very good at their warrior ethos, at raping, at pillaging, and they were kind of like the way ISIS, if you imagine how the CIA has used radical Islamic extremism in the last, decades, kind of the same thing. It's a very convenient way of having mercenary psychos do your dirty work and destabilize governments and destabilize regions you don't like. And they would be rewarded with certain territories as long as they remained obedient. But an agreement was reached to provide the Merovingians the support that they needed to become the top dogs, which they did. And again, even after Clovis I became a Christianized Merovingian, he was still known, and his family, the dynasty, was still known as the Sorcerer Kings, because they were known as sorcerers. They were known as conducting intercourse with black magic forces, necromancy, and other things. The players on the stage of this particular drama that I want to talk about today that will play a very important role, I've already introduced a couple of them. Charlemagne, they're featured on the left. The guy with the big hat is Harun al-Rashid. On the right is the Taizong Emperor, who ruled in the middle 8th century, middle to late 8th century in China, the new Tang dynasty that had emerged in the wake of the collapse of the Han dynasty that collapsed in the 2nd century, or 200 AD. So with the Han dynasty collapse, the Silk Road fell kind of into disarray. This happened around the same time that the Western Roman Empire was also going to collapse as well. And both China went into a period of crisis, just like what I went through with Rome. So too did we have something like 14 different dynasties emerge and disappear in the 400-year period between 200 AD and the collapse of the Silk Road, and the emergence in 619 or 618 of the Tang dynasty in China. And so 400 years in China, you went through like over 14 different dynasties battling it out, different factions taking control at the same time, each one declaring themselves emperor of all of China and going into wars. And then with the Tang Dynasty revival, they were able to restore again a unified China. We're gonna look at some maps. And one of the key figures to expand China during the Tang Dynasty and revive the Silk Road was the Taizong Emperor. And the guy there on the third from the right is an illustration of King Bulan. King Bulan was the leader of a certain district of the Göktürk Empire. Here's the picture of the Göktürk Empire that existed for about 50 years or so at its greatest extent, that stretched all the way from the Pacific all the way to really much of today's Ukraine. Crimea is there on the Black Sea, and down through much of today's Middle East, right? Just over Persia, through some of Afghanistan too. So the Göktürk Empire had an westernmost district, and that became Khazaria. And so this guy here, King Bulan, was the leader during the mid-8th century of Khazaria. He's the guy who decided to go with Judaism when selecting what would be the state. It was agreed upon that with the emergence of monotheism around the world as the basis of global order, global geopolitics, even though it became often war making, it was no longer expedient to be a society of animism that worshipped, shamanism or shamanic spirits and things like that. So instead, which was formerly the Göktürk Empire, it was a society that didn't really have a very strong central government per se. It didn't really have a strong religious philosophy, but with the carving out of that space that became Khazaria, it was like, okay, well, we have an Abrahamic dynasty and empire to our south. We have an Abrahamic monotheistic dynasty to our west, Charlemagne's Christendom, and then we have also a Confucian dynasty in China. So what do we do? And so there was several years of debate about what school to adopt, and a decision was made by the advisors of King Bulan to go with Judaism instead as one of the three Abrahamic faiths, with the idea that they were the least politically charged, that there was a lot of animosity between the Muslims and the Christians, even between different factions within Christendom, within the Byzantines and the Western Christians. But the idea was, okay, it would be best expedient for diplomacy and trade to go with Judaism as our state religion. And that way we won't have the same kind of beef with our neighbors, and we'll be able to be sort of a conduit and intermediary, and better thrive and have commerce, was the logic of the day, according to records made by Islamic scholars. So let's say a little bit more about that. So the Göktürk Empire stretched, like I said, this is around 578 at its maximum extent. It had managed to have intermarriage with some of the Chinese leadership of the time as it grew. It was a Turkic-based empire that had spread first eastward and then westward. A lot of it was based upon nomadic lifestyles. A lot of tribes. It was kind of like a federation. So you'd have different tribes with, I guess, proto-like Seljuk kind of systems, where you had a bey of some sort, or different beys would be like local tribal leaders, and then they would come into parliament. They would have communion with each other, and they would have a Khagan at the top, who would be sort of recognized as the formal prima inter pares. And they began to intermarry while the Chinese were still pre-Tang, right? Pre-618. They were still going through chaos. There was various dynasties, and they would intermarry with some of the ruling families of the Wei dynasty, of the Northern Zhou dynasty, in 562, 568. You had in many ways, because they were the first sort of unified culture to gain any kind of real foothold of influence over the Eurasian steppes and Central Caucasus all the way to Europe, they played a big role in reviving the Silk Road that had been almost forgotten. The Silk Road, corridors east to west. So that was happening, but they weren't very centrally managed. They weren't very good at harmonizing their policies very well. So they were weak in that sense. And when the Tang Dynasty came about, the Gokturks began to fall under this sway, especially in the east of the Chinese. And so what you had there was the Eastern Khaganate and the Sui dynasty of China. The Eastern Khaganate broke up, just like the Roman Empire did, between a Western and an Eastern faction to maintain control. The Eastern was absorbed by most of China, but it pretty much collapsed by 630. And by 643, the Western Khaganate also melted down. And with the Eastern was sort of the center of the capital. And so without any kind of oversight, the Western became more independent. The Western, like I said, ended up collapsing. And what was left was Khazaria. So the Western collapsed, leaving Khazaria, which is featured there. Oops. That's Khazaria. And Khazaria, like I said, was for about a century independently oriented. It still had, according to scholars, a lot of influence because of their communion with the Chinese Confucian traditions. They had certain Chinese Confucian concepts like the mandate of heaven, Tiangming, Tianxia as well, which is a secondary feature of the mandate of heaven. The idea that there's a natural patriarchal hierarchy of the father, the idea that the heavens are managed by order, by a unifying principle, that amongst those principles are justice. That idea of Tianxia was something that was, again, very, very much rooted in the Confucian tradition, and that was infused into the Gokturks. Tiangming is additionally more based upon the moral aspects of that, and that benevolence, the idea of Ren, of justice, of the Christian language, we might consider this like agape, being the foundation of natural law. That was the Tiangming idea. And so, together they did form a certain foundation of natural law that we had seen also emerge under the Christian Platonic humanists around St. Augustine, earlier St. Irenaeus of Lyon, of Clement, Origen, also of Alexandria, who all advanced upon this notion that, okay, you have a law in heaven, a law of God, and then you have laws that humans make, and how do they work together, or how do they mesh together, or not? And from the standpoint of the Augustinians, the Christian humanists, as well as those Confucians, the followers of the genuine Confucius and Mencius, who understood Tiangming and Tianxia, the idea was, okay, that's the foundation upon which we judge whether a law that man makes is good or bad. Is it obedient to the law of heaven or not? If it's not, then it's a form of violence. If it's not, then it's really it's not a law at all. It's only a rule that humans made based upon the rule of the stronger to impose itself on the weaker to basically keep a master-slave kind of system of feudalism alive, and thus should be overthrown. It should be overthrown. It has no bearing on universality. It should not be respected. And so too do we find also in the writings of Mencius, the Chinese follower of Confucius, the edict that when a ruler betrays the mandate of heaven, then it is upon the people to overthrow said ruler and said government in order to reinstitute a better government that is more befitting of the mandate of heaven. That is Mencius directly. It could have almost have been Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers, and that is largely why Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson and Thomas Paine studied Confucius, and that's why Ben Franklin was publishing Confucian texts. So this is all sorts of things that were animating the Gokturks. That was what was animating the Khazarian sort of legal philosophy. Again, that's a very famous image. That's the location of Khazaria at its maximum extent, right? Featuring some chunks of today's Ukraine. You got Crimea over there, big chunk of Russia. And of course, there's some very bad people with a very bad idea of what they think Khazaria is, who want to use a very evil idea of Khazaria today to do very bad things. I'm not denying that either. And just to go back here quickly, that's the Tang Empire. For those who might have missed it, the Tang Empire did grow in extent. It started small and then grew in influence as the Gokturks lost their influence. So you have these protectorates, these territories externally, right, that stretched quite far. So the influence of the Tang Empire at its maximum extent, we can see stretched all the way through to Persia and really pressing on the borders of Iran and Afghanistan. That's a lot of influence. But the center was still Xi'an. Interestingly, the capital of the Tang Empire in Xi'an is also where the Xi'an to Tehran railway was recently completed just a few months ago, before the Israelis struck with the Americans to bomb Iran for the first time. And this has been targeted. So this rail line from Xi'an to Tehran, as a node of the Silk Road, was unfortunately really damaged under U.S.-Israeli attacks, and that's an unfortunate design, is to make sure that this ancient idea not be permitted to be reborn again. And at the same time, just to show again, we already saw the picture of the north-south transportation corridor between Russia down through Persia. So too did we have the north-south Silk Road in ancient times. This is the pre-Christian Rus states and there you have the picture of the Khazar Khaganate above the Black Sea. And in purple are the trade routes, in red are the trade routes stretching down through the Caspian as well through the Black Sea, north-south, as well as the orange east-west corridors all the way up through Charlemagne's Europe. Now, one thing I didn't say, I mentioned the Merovingians, and I didn't say something important about that, because the Merovingians were overthrown by Charlemagne's grandfather. Haha, forgot to mention that. That's important. So this area, though they created, just like the Qing dynasty created an administrative unified state, they were still very abusive. They were still very pagan. They were still very dangerous. I think the rights of human sacrifice were still very strong, even under a pagan veneer. But the mayor at the time of Paris, who was Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, was able to usurp control and impose a new leadership, ousting the Merovingians in a series of battles. He did a great job. And then his son, Pepin the Short, the king Pepin, was able to then take control and expand the Merovingian, what became known as the Frankish, increasingly, empire, the Frankish dynasty, evermore into a variety of directions. Took control of a big chunk. Pepin took a big chunk of Islamic Spain, what was known as the Umayyads, that had been kicked out of the Abbasid, or had been kicked out of the Middle East. The Umayyads were the first dynasty coming out of Muhammad. And after about 4 or 5 caliphs, they lost control in Baghdad and were ousted completely and had to regroup in Spain, for good and for bad, because there were some bad black magic undercurrents that came with. But, there were also some good things too, regarding Andalusia, the Islamic philosophical school that were studying some of the best philosophies and looking for common moral ground around which peace could be won. But at the same time, there was bad things too. So there was a forced negotiation, as Pepin had consolidated a lot more Christian control over the northern part of Spain. And this is going to come in more into play later on in our conversation. So Charlemagne would emerge into power in the middle to late 8th century and would endure until, I think he died in 812 or 815 or so. So, okay, we've got the north-south trade routes. We've got the Khazaria as well, the breakaway Gokturks that under King Bulan, after about a century, went for Judaism. But let's say it's not so clear. When I said that King Bulan went for Judaism of all the choices, what does that mean? Was it purely a Jewish kingdom? Not really. And here's why. So according to the writings of 2 Islamic scholars, and I cite from this extensively in my book, also Pierre Baudry, a historian who taught me a lot about historical research and who wrote the first book in my Untold History of Canada book series, Pierre Baudry, fantastic researcher. He did a whole book that's available online and that I've drawn from extensively in my research on this topic, on Charlemagne's ecumenical alliance with other nations. Again, I've brought in some of my own original research, but I'm also internalizing a lot of the work that he's done. And he cites especially two key sources, contemporaries who still lived as Islamic geographers and historians during the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. There's actually four that he cites, but I drew from two of them that I like the most. One is Al-Masudi, who wrote Meadows of Gold, who lived from 896 to 956, and who wrote extensively about Khazaria. Also, Ibn Qurduba was another Islamic geographer. And finally, Abu al-Istakar, Istakar, who is a Persian historian of the 10th century. And Abu al-Istakar writes of Khazaria and the judicial system that controlled the Khazarian world, saying that it had an interesting, very unique form of organization. He says, quote, "The king has 7 judges known as Hukan, from the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and the idolaters." The idolaters were basically a loose name for pagan, because there were still a lot of pagan who lived under the jurisdictions and needed some form of representation in the courts and the legal systems. So the king has 7 judges. That's like the Supreme Court. When the people have a lawsuit, it is they who judge it. The parties do not approach the king himself, but only these judges. So for all major decisions of law, the way these 7 judges worked is you had 2 Jews, 2 Christians, 2 Muslims, 1 idolater, one pagan, and they would be sort of the judge and jury of all key legal decisions. Very unique, and we've never seen that before. An effort to really find a way to live with multiplicity while again looking for what makes us human, what makes us harmonious with ourselves, with all the moving, diverse parts. So very interesting idea. Another fact that's of historical irony that I find is interesting. Pierre Bourdieu brought this to my attention, but it is substantiated by these Islamic scholars living during that time who wrote about this, is that the military of Khazaria didn't exist. There was no Jewish military in Khazaria. What you did have was an agreement between Khazaria and the Muslim kingdom of the Abbasids, whereby 10,000 Muslim soldiers were allowed to exist in Khazaria as a standing army. They were allowed to live there, be provided for. You know, they had taxes to pay, but I think they had some benefits too because they were a standing army. But they were allowed to live as an organized armed army in Khazaria to defend Khazaria, under the one condition that if the Jewish kingdom were to ever get into a conflict with a Muslim kingdom, then the soldiers would turn on Khazaria and fight for the Muslim rivals. Interesting. Hard to imagine that kind of arrangement being made in today's world, but they were key. The Jewish Khazarian representatives from Bulan's court were very instrumental in embassies. In embassies for peace, business deals, the revival of the Silk Road, the management of the Silk Road corridors, and the Ecumenical Council, like I said. Here's the former, much larger now, Merovingian Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne and his father. And here in green is Charlemagne's kingdom in 771. And when he increased it into northern Italy, into Corsica. Again, the Spanish Umayyads, there was a Spanish march, whereby still most people living under the Spanish zone of Charlemagne's kingdom were still Muslim, but it was now under Christian leadership. And in the north in Saxony, where there was a lot of sort of Nordic, Viking, basically witches, shamanic witches with human sacrifice. It wasn't a pretty religion, but there was a conversion process. Some would say overly forcefully handled. I don't know. It's difficult when you're dealing with like black magic forces of barbarism that is weaponized by higher occult priesthoods that want to use these ISIS-like forces to destroy you. So how do you approach that? Now, Charlemagne did forced conversions for a lot of them. Is that right? No, it's not right. Was it necessary to do at the time that he did it? Maybe. From the more I've read, it didn't look like you couldn't really have a dialogue with a lot of these human sacrifice and cults. So it's like, what do you do? Hard to eat. I'm just saying all of this because it's easy to cast judgment from the present into the past, but it's hard to say. Definitely the Druidic culture. Maybe the Druids. I've seen evidence that the earlier Druids of the 3rd century BC had a certain noble refinement. We're not so much into the black magic stuff, but unfortunately, in the centuries ensuing, that different practices were increasingly brought online, and it got ugly. In the upper right-hand side, just so people know, is an image about 45 or 50 years after Charlemagne dies, called the Partition of Verdun, which was carried out by his grandchildren, 3 stupid kids. One Lothar, one Charles, one Louis, and they basically were induced by bad advisors to carve up the kingdom, creating the foundations essentially for today's Europe, and the European borders that we currently see were largely found at that Partition of Verdun of 842, where Charles and Louis agreed that they would have an alliance whereby forever that these 2 brothers, should they get into a conflict with Lothar, their 3rd brother, who would have jurisdiction over the kingdoms of the middle of much of today's Germany and down to Italy, if a conflict were to happen between any one of them, they would both pile up on Lothar. So Lotharingia became the foundation of like a lot of the grievances, the transgenerational revanchism between the Alsace and Lorraine peoples of France and Germany, for example. If you want to know why that psychodynamic has been there for so many centuries, we saw it in the 30 Years' War, we saw it in World War I, we saw it in the French-German wars of the 19th century. Why are they always battling for these territories in Lotharingia, in the former Lotharingia? That's why. It has largely this to blame. Aachen, there in the center, was the capital of Charlemagne's dynasty, his empire. So, and also one thing about Charlemagne is he was an Augustinian. The most popular works in his kingdom, and we're going to see more about this, was the Bible, and also St. Augustine's City of God, and St. Augustine's on Christian education. So, which are beautiful works. I've read them many times, and these are works that are Platonic in nature. They're based on a Platonic method or philosophy of teaching and institutionalizing the idea of teaching by discovery. That you want to not just reserve the right of knowledge to the elites, but you assume, right? You have faith that God's creation expresses itself self-consciously to all humans of all classes of life, all conditions and all creeds. Everybody is a baby, has the divine spark, and has the divine spark of potential genius if you give them the opportunity to have genuine education, to make discoveries, eurekas, and that true education should be the bringing forth of within, the enthusiasm of awakening from within the discoveries by asking potent questions, not by imposing answers from the outside into the mind of a student that let's say an Aristotelian might treat like a blank slate to be written upon by those who have power, or a vessel to be filled, right? That has a limit. The Platonic view of Augustine and of Charlemagne and his leading advisor, Alcuin of York, an amazing figure, was that no, the true education is like a fire you bring forth from within, right? You have to provide oxygen to the fire by asking good, potent questions, by providing love, right? Which is the oxygen of the heart. And then that's a good teacher. And that should be the foundation of good education. And again, Charlemagne, my God, I just realized my damn microphone on itself went by default back onto my computer. So whenever that happened, I suppose it might have happened during the commercials, which I haven't even read yet. I do apologize, but the quality of my sound has probably been low. Anyway, here we are. So this is the sort of thing that Charlemagne was doing with his education reforms. And here's an interesting thing. At the same time that Khazaria basically existed as a Jewish kingdom, You have a Renaissance dynamic of increased population, increased beauty, increased qualities of creative innovations in technology, in infrastructure, in architecture within the Christian kingdom, peacemaking maneuvers between the Christian and the Muslim world, but also you had what's known as the Abbasid Renaissance at the same time, of houses of wisdom, of other beautiful things occurring within the Muslim world. And if you look at what was making a lot of this possible, it was Jewish diplomats managing the embassies, the Radhanite Jewish traders that had spoken famously like 8 or 9 languages, Slavic and Chinese and different Indian dialects, as well as Frankish and so many other languages, Spanish and Greek and Persian and Arab. So, this is all going on. So is Khazaria truly as this evil place, this Mordor, where people go to get raped, to get turned into slaves, to die, to be killed? It's like Lord of the Rings Mordor. That's how it's being portrayed by David Icke and so many others today. Is it really that? Because if it was that, why is there so much prosperity and peacemaking going on through the efforts and collusion with Khazaria, which is a major conduit of the Silk Road in the north, the Steppe Silk Road? Why is that happening? Actually, before we do anything else, let's do something I should have already done a while ago, and we'll take a pause on this and listen to a word from today's sponsors. All right, so this is hopefully we're gonna shift gears and go even faster here. All right, so the first sponsor we have today is Pet Club. There we go.
Science proves that a healthy immune system is the body's first defense against the smallest of ailments to the most catastrophic. Coriolus versicolor is the most sought-after, all-natural supplement for both humans and pets to help boost the immune system. There are over 400 studies worldwide on its effectiveness in humans, including Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and now from the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. Together, we can help reverse this terrible tide now plaguing your loved ones and give them the immune-boosting supplements that they need.
Badlandsmedia.tv/pet club.
All right, and now let's have a word from the next ad we have is River BTC. Here we go. Let's play it.
Your bank kept $1,600 from you in 2025. You probably didn't notice. Now multiply that by millions of Americans. That's over $433 billion in interest the banks kept. Your money goes in. Banks put it to work. They make record profits. You get almost nothing in return. And when they blow up, guess who has to bail them out? So what are you supposed to do? Ask politely? Wait? Accept that this is just how banking works? Or you could put your money where it works for you. On River, your cash earns 3.3%, paid in Bitcoin. Earning Bitcoin gives your money even more room to grow. And it's just as easy as how you bank today. You can get paid, pay your bills, and access your money anytime. Start banking with Bitcoin on River.
Badlandsmedia.tv/river. You will not regret it.
All right, we're back. Okay, so let's get back onto the show here. All right, where was I? Sorry, I was scanning through the comments section just to see if there's anything that I should flag for the end of the show, and there are a few comments that I think are worth bringing up soon. All right, so let's go back to this. So we already saw Septimania here. That's known as Septimania, this area of the south of the area that's in Spain. Now, the area of Septimania, just quickly here, which is basically south of France, Narbonne, very strategic. It was a maritime Silk Road corridor as well of goods coming in and out of Asia, but it had, again, a very interesting type of system, even though once Charlemagne had taken control, as I mentioned, the population was still majority Muslim. Let me make sure that my microphone is the good microphone. Yes, it is. The governance that he selected, though, was divided by Charlemagne with 1/3 under the authority of the Archbishop Thomas of Normandy, that is a Christian archbishop. 1/3 would be under the Islamic Viscount, and 1/3 would be under Jewish governance, ironically putting a Muslim territory under Jewish and Christian protection. There's a figure that he invited in from the House of David living in Baghdad that he said, hey, okay, just to legitimize this, to provide some representation for the Jews, from the House of what's called, what's his name? Oh, forgetting now. No, it's escaping me. It's escaping me. But there was basically a Jew from the House of David that he brought in to be a local king of Septimania, as well, who gave Charlemagne his daughter. And this was actually Pepin who did this. So Pepin invited, the father of Charlemagne invited this Jewish figure from Baghdad to be the king of Septimania. The king gave his daughter to Charlemagne, Pepin, who was still very young at the time, and Pepin said yes, is for diplomatic reasons. And Pepin, in turn, provided his daughter to this Jewish king to marry. So again, diplomatic marriages back in the day were very important, and this was just an interesting way of flanking those who would wish to create animosity and war between different cultures. This brings us back to that original painting that we had seen at the very beginning of an embassy. So back in 810 or so, there was an effort by the papacy to get a crusade going, to say to put pressure to Charlemagne, saying that, hey, look, you are now the Holy Roman Emperor, which Charlemagne had tried to avoid for about 20 years. There were invitations and efforts by the papacy to make him the Holy Roman Emperor, which would have been basically a new Roman emperor to be the satrap or the warlord under the control of the hierarchy of the Vatican. And he tried to avoid it. And then one day in 800 AD, he was invited to a celebration, a Christmas feast in Rome. And as soon as he got off his carriage, a trap was set. As this is like academically accepted, surprisingly enough, his biographers have pointed out this, even though they try to celebrate the fact that he was the first Holy Roman Emperor, they have to admit that he really worked hard to avoid it because he liked having independence. He really wanted independence, and not to be swayed by the influence of the corrupt Rome. But despite his efforts in 800, when he stepped out of the carriage, a ceremony was immediately set up whereby a crown was put on his head, and the Pope was basically waiting there. I think it was Stephen III, to say, "Hey, congratulations, surprise! You're the Holy Roman Emperor. And you're ours now." So they did that. Now he still did maintain independence, but there was more pressure right now for him to say to bend the knee, let's just say, to the Pope, and thus to be used as a battering ram to take back the Holy Land, and ultimately to also go to war with the Byzantine Empire. Right, that was another thing, which is where Charlemagne had even made an arrangement on the one hand to marry the Byzantine Empress, Empress Irene, who is known as the Grecian princess. So she was a Hellenic Greek scholar. She was, I think, the first female leader of the Byzantine Empire. And she and Charlemagne realized that there was an effort to get them to go to war with each other. And the way that they got out of it is that they agreed to marry, to basically get married, which would have changed history in a very interesting way. Unfortunately, certain figures within the Byzantine courts didn't like this and orchestrated her coup, her ouster and exile, which put an end to that effort. And she lived out her days in exile on an island. Her kid was killed. And Charlemagne's plans to ally then with the Byzantium ended. But, they were not able to sabotage what Ambassador, what's his name, Isaac of Rocken was able to orchestrate, whereby instead of going to war for the Holy Land, he had the idea that he sold effectively to Harun al-Rashid, featured there in the painting, saying, okay, just give us the Holy Land. Give Charlemagne the Holy Land, and you defend it, and no need to fight. And so Harun al-Rashid said, yeah, that's a great idea. And Harun sent an embassy back featuring a big elephant and gold and silk and other things with a deed, with the ambassador back to Charlemagne saying, okay, we are giving you as a gift the Holy Land. It is yours. And we will be the defenders of the Holy Land, and you will own it. And Charlemagne said, that's great. And he literally rode that elephant until the day he died. It was his favorite animal. He rode it into war. He rode it everywhere. Everyone else had horses in Europe. He had his elephant. It was pretty funny. And that was just, again, a very brilliant thing. Not only that, though, the houses of wisdom that Harun al-Rashid and his father Mamun, Harun al-Mamun was his father, also a good guy, a contemporary of Pepin the Short, King Pepin. They'd sponsored these houses of wisdom, and these houses of wisdom, you can read about them online. They're fantastic, but these were basically like Platonic academies spread out in Baghdad, but also all throughout the Muslim world, which were centers of astronomy where Muslims and Christians and Jews and people from scientists from China and from India would all come together to study astronomy, to compose poetry, to transcribe and to translate ancient texts of Rome, of Latin, of Greek, of Hebrew, of Aramaic. Quite something. I mean, it's really, these were educational and academies. They were research centers. There were diplomatic cultural exchange centers. Inventions were being worked on in these incredible stuff. So that was also made possible. This piece provided for a space where the students of different cultures could come and work together, to learn together, to teach together. Again, just to give a sample of the type of thinking of Pope Stephen III writing to Archbishop Adalbert of Charlemagne's court in 780. He was, again, pushing for a crusade, and he was complaining, saying, Christians work in the vineyards and the fields of these Jews. Christian men and women live under the same roof as these prevaricators, listening to their blasphemous language. Night and day, these miserable men and women always have to humiliate themselves before the demeaning display of dogs. What communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? So, guy really didn't like the Jews at all, right? And you got to keep in mind, too, like back then, there was despite the fact that at the best of times, Christians and Jews had worked together in opposition to the Roman Empire, as we had seen with the case of Rabbi Philo of Alexandria and Peter, the apostle of Jesus, working together, collaborating together against Simon the magician, the father of the Gnostics, who was being supported by Nero. This is according to Eusebius, the early church historian, who documented the leadership of Rabbi Philo and his school, working with the early Christian school of Peter together to expose the trickery, the sorcery of Simon the magician. At the best of times, this is the type of collaboration we had seen, but that was subverted quite a bit under the Roman Empire, that often pitted the Jews against the Christians and the Christians against the Jews. And so too did we find the same thing back then too. So there was already anti-Jewish persecution in 610. You had Heraclius, the emperor of Byzantium, cracked down on the Jews, forcing conversions at the threat of death, confiscating Jewish possessions. Justinian, another emperor, and from 685 to 695, was also persecuting the Jews in the Christian Empire. You had Leo III also do the same thing. You had Romanos, the emperor in the 10th century, who was also persecuting the Jews. So, you know, there is something to the Jewish scapegoat thing. It's not just a mythology. There is something real to that. And whenever basically these black magician, high priesthood Satanists get caught doing something evil, they always have the excuse of basically saying, yeah, that evil thing is happening, but by the way, you can give your torches and pitchforks to these Jews. Look at the Jews. It's their fault. They're the Christ killers. Go get them. And due to the fact that there is this relationship of the Hofjuden that goes back to Pharaoh's Jews and the Babylonian high priests that were loyal to the Babylonian overlords, there is a treacherous Jewish faction that has been used as well to be the enforcers of empire, which at different times has not worked out well for the Jewish people as a whole, knowing that they've been tolerating this faction to be there representing or professing to represent the Jewish people, but in fact being Satanists in their inner heart. So anyway, that's what Pope Stephen was trying to push, both a war against the Muslims, a war against the Jews. And to reemphasize here, Renaissance dynamics going on everywhere. That's just one example of one of the leading new types of art of Carolingian architecture that later on was perverted to become Gothic architecture, but it really had its blossoming in the Carolingian under Charlemagne's sponsorship of beautiful architecture. And what do we have? That's just the insides of the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, built between 792 to 805 is when it was constructed. Beautiful, beautiful designs. Vast roads, bridges over the Rhine, canals, cathedrals, schools were built. Lots of schools were built. Lots of roads were built. Sewage also was built up. Again, the reviving the art of Roman sewage management was being revived after being lost as an art. Plumbing, things like that, was being revived under Charlemagne. Financial reforms, which saw private financiers lose control as Charlemagne's government took control of coinage and credit, was also a big deal. Monastery reforms. So he forced monks to be productive citizens, basically saying, hey, you can't just be a monk and live the good life, drinking wine and enjoying the spoils of the labor of the feudal serfs. You can't do that. You have to, if you're going to be a monk, you have to work. You have to do agriculture. You have to do textiles. If you're going to be a nun, you got to do work, right? Big deal. That very much loosened. It broke a lot of the bureaucratic corruption that was baked into the Merovingian Empire. He also applied, as I said, he loved St. Augustine, as I do, very much so. He loved Plato through the teachings of Alcuin, his leading advisor and sort of the grand designer of so many of his reforms. Alcuin of York is just an incredible figure who was trained in the Platonic Academy in Ireland. Was called Clon MacNoise, before going back into the mainland and rising up to become the leading advisor to Charlemagne. According to this excellent historian, Thomas MacDonald, who wrote of the doctrine of the witness. What is this? This is a Christian policy coined, developed by Augustine and applied by Charlemagne to avoid having to persecute and carry out injustices on the Jewish population living in his territory. And basically what this is, I'll read it from Thomas MacDonald here. So Thomas says, his positions is that the Jews are under a divine order of physical protection, and that not only must they be protected, but they must be allowed to worship as Jews. You can't do forced conversions on the Jews. His reason for this view is demeaning for Jews. So it's true. Like when Augustine writes about what his doctrine, it is a bit demeaning on the Jews. It's true. But it also informed centuries of theology and countless orders of protection of the Jews living in Christian lands. When Jews were persecuted at the hands of Christians, it was in direct defiance of this doctrine. And when they were protected, it was because of this influence. That's so important. So basically the idea was, the existence of the Jews is, under Augustine's legal argument, was that they provide witness to the proof of the Bible, and that the proof of the Bible gives rise to the evidence of Jesus's ministry being something legitimate. So again, it's a bit of a sleight of hand, but it worked pretty well at helping to save a lot of lives. And there's a certain grounding to it. And in the Muslim world, that was called the doctrine of the dhimmi. Same thing. It was the Augustinian doctrine adopted by the Muslims to also say, hey, look, we're all Abrahamic. Everyone, all of these three faiths come from the Abraham and have a lot of common moral lessons within the Quran, within the Jewish Bible, within the Christian Bible. A lot of the same lessons, a lot of the same stories, a lot of the same players, a lot of the same core universal concepts. So we should respect the Jews. We should protect the Jews, even though we don't like them necessarily, or we don't like necessarily their choices in theology. Despite that, we should protect them because of a respect of their common roots. So again, it did play a big role in saving a lot of lives and creating a space of life out of which some dialogue, respect, collaboration was able to happen. I mentioned briefly the Houses of Wisdom, but there's an image of a piece of art showcasing the type of activity done. This is in the case of the astronomy wing of one of the Houses of Wisdom in Baghdad. And this is from my paper. I write, under the humanist leadership of Caliph al-Mahdi, the son of Harun al-Rashid, whose father was also al-Mahdi, so it's a bit confusing, and the grandson of al-Mamun. Oh, no, sorry, al-Mamun and al-Mahdi, yeah, two different guys. Networks of humanist education centers were created called houses of wisdom, which brought Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars together to translate ancient works of Greek and Latin, study astronomy, literature, medicine, and engineering. Paper mills were established in 832 in Samarkand, Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, applying Chinese technology to broaden humanity's access to knowledge. So also printing presses largely were even being influenced. China was already doing printing presses when the West was still transcribing by hand for centuries. But a lot of the technologies, gunpowder, which had industrial applications as well as defensive purposes, also came out of China. So there's a lot of sharing of inventions as well as cultural productions. In the Chinese Tang Dynasty, that was also a Renaissance, right? So you got three Renaissance dynamics that never happens, where these cultures are working together. During the 300 years of Tang rule, the arts rose to new heights, and the poet-statesman idea became an actualized ideal as the greatest poets and painters, such as Wang Wei, Li Bai, and Du Fu, played major roles as political figures. Torture and death penalties were nearly done away with, and public schools were built at record numbers. Massive religious tolerance, so you had Jews, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, others being given sanctuary as well. So high level of tolerance in China, large because it was not really an evangelical kind of religious culture. It was more, if anybody looks into Confucianism, there is a sort of metaphysical aspect. There's a certain idea of, as I mentioned, the mandate of heaven, but it's not so much like a mandate to evangelize so much. It's more philosophical in that sense. And for good or for bad, it could be infiltrated also that way too, by not having like any hardcore religious creeds per se. It could be open to infiltration, as we'd also seen over time if you're not very wise. What else allowed this beautiful dynamic of, I would say, a healthy ecumenicism to come undone? The Crusades. So it took 2 centuries more, a little bit more than 2 centuries, but finally by 1098, the Crusades were launched. Even earlier, it was beginning already with the growth and the deployment of the Normans, the Northmen, who again were a Viking tribal group that was used as kind of like the Mongolian hordes were used later by Venice. So too were these groups also used to destroy first and get control of France, or a big chunk of France. They brought in feudalism. They were then deployed to take control, to overthrow the Anglo-Saxon leadership of England, the leadership around Alfred the Great and other decent people who were trying to revive a healthy Augustinian Platonic form of governance. They were ousted, and in their stead was brought in the Viking Northmen, the Normans, with their doomsday books and their feudalism that were brought in. And so too also in Italy. And this became the foundation around which the later, basically these are the images of the Crusades, first, second, third, fourth Crusades, peaking all the way at the fourth in 1204, which saw Venice funding it and carrying out a major coup, whereby in the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders didn't even fight any Muslims. They didn't even go to the Holy Land, which is featured there on the map there in red, around the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At its maximum extent is there in red, with Jerusalem as the center. That was a Frankish kingdom run by basically Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and most importantly, Templar Knights. But they didn't make it to the Holy Land for the Fourth Crusade. They basically were redirected towards Constantinople, the center of Byzantium, and looted it. They destroyed it, and basically had so much gold and loot that they just put that on their ship, paid off their debts to the Venetians, and then some, and then went back home. So that was when Venice, as the junior partner of the Byzantine Empire, basically took control and became the senior partner of the empire, and took control of the maritime trade routes, which are featured there. So that's the Venice as it grew into the biggest expansive empire. The Templars played a big role in that as well. So here's a picture. Oh, also the trade routes. So the former Silk Road trade routes that were managed by the Radhanites, the Jewish Radhanite traders, that were the basis of commerce and cooperation for centuries, they were transformed under the Normans, under the Franks, to become corridors of war, where fortresses were built up, run by Templars and what have you. That's again the picture of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its maximum extent. with the flag of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That's the same flag that people might recognize as an emblem, was tattooed on the chest of, or is tattooed on the chest of today's Minister of Defense, or the head of the Department of War, Pete Hegseth. It also is the image of the equestrian order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem that still exists to this day. I think there's about 40,000 knights and dames of this order that was founded in 1098 to oversee and manage the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but especially the order of the Holy Sepulchre, the place, the fabled place of Jesus's death. I think that there's some arguments to be made for the fact that that's actually a hoax that was made up as a location for geopolitical purposes, but that's a whole other show unto itself. And this endured up until the 1291, and it was, some people would like to bring this back today. What I didn't mention, and Mike and we talked about this in our last show on Breaking Free of Psyops, but just to be clear, the actual name of the Knights Templar, which was founded in 1118, was the Knights of the Poor Knights of the Order of Solomon's Temple. So their major motive was to revive, basically build Solomon's Temple for the third time, something that Julian the Apostate had tried to do but died before he could get it done. It was a ritual center in the mind of the Gnostic inner elite that managed and created the Templar Order, as well as the Knights Hospitaller, otherwise known as later on the Knights of Malta. And many of the chivalric orders that are patronized by the leading royal bloodlines of the European and former Roman royal lineages, the patrician classes. So they practiced Gnosticism on the inside, as was discovered in the infiltration of their order under the orders of Philip IV and his allies, who wanted to really prove how there was human sacrifice, the worship of Baphomet, the worship of basically the practice of witchcraft, of necromancy, of Satanism at the inner core of this order. People say, "Oh, that's just him not wanting to pay his debts. It's all make believe." No, in my research, it's actually true. There's nothing good about the Templars. People say, "Oh no, the Templars were good Christians. They're just misunderstood. They just were taken down because they controlled too much of the world banking, and the Pope and the kings of Europe didn't want to pay their debts to the noble Templar bankers. But they're noble." It's like, no, they were, and those who actually directly follow through in their lineage, from the Order of Montesa, the Order of Jesus Christ in Portugal, the Order of the Garter in England, the revived, Templar order that reemerged in that form, the Scottish Rite that emerged and was incubated through Robert the Bruce's sponsorship of the Templars in Scotland, and their incubation in France, where the Order of the Scottish Rite was grown even more and infused with more and more esoteric practice of dark magic, before being filtered back into the United States, even into England, and then into the United States through things like Albert Pike. Albert Pike being this guy here, who wrote about in his Morals and Dogma, the founder of the Scottish Rite, or the founder of the KKK, the Order of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Grand Master of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, a Confederate general. He wrote in his Morals and Dogma how the Templars were unintelligent and therefore unsuccessful Jesuits. Their watchword was to become wealthy in order to buy the world. They became so, and in 1312 they possessed in Europe alone more than 9,000 seigneuries. Riches were the shoal on which they were wrecked. They became insolent and unwisely showed their contempt for the religious and social institutions which they aimed to overthrow. Their ambition was fatal to them. I think he's telling the truth. I think he knew exactly what he was talking about, and he situated his lineage directly as a healthy rebranding of the Templar Order, completely. That's in fact the Empire of the Golden Circle, a maritime empire rooted in Cuba that he had intended to bring about. The Order of the Golden Circle is a Templar modeled chivalric knighthood that also doubled as a secret society, of which John Wilkes Booth and every leading member of the Confederate government of America was a member of, that sought once liberated from the Union, to create a new kind of empire that would be expansive, that would spread the institution of human slavery, and that would be centered in Cuba, and that would extend all the way down into Venezuela, all of Central America, most of Mexico, and then spread with a pro-British alliance. That was their proposed territory in 1860, had they been successful. Again, let's review that now. Maritime Empire. Before this empire migrated into England, it was in Venice. Venice was the center also of, they'd provided the headquarters for the Teutonic Knights, another neo-Templar knighthood, but that had been rooted in Germany under the Holy Roman Empire, and that did a lot of damage. That gave its headquarters to Venice, but also Venice was also, at a different time, the headquarters of the Order of Malta at a certain moment. Before Malta was created as the new hub and base of the Order of Malta, aka formerly the Knights Hospitaller, aka the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, which is a long story unto itself. As I mentioned, the Order of the Holy Sepulchre had a very strange uniform. That's today one of their uniforms that they present themselves in public, featuring there the flag or the emblem of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is something that people might have noticed is somewhat familiar to a thing that was going on by the followers of Albert Pike across America, who would make a practice of burning crosses and lynching inferior Untermenschen that they didn't like. So that's something that was that's still a practice. The hooded, spiky hooded garb of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. The Knights Hospitaller were set up also by a Byzantine grand strategist named Gerard of Sasso, just like a Byzantine spin-off group of Cistercians under Bernard de Clairvaux shaped the Templars. This was created around the same year that the Order of Sepulchre was created to oversee the Crusades and manage this new Kingdom of Jerusalem. I would say also rebuild Solomon's Temple as a zone that they believe is an area of global human sacrifice and mystery cult controls. It's sacred for all the wrong reasons. As I mentioned, the Sovereign Hospitaller Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, it became known as the Knights of Malta in 1530, 4 years before the Jesuit order was created, which, as Albert Pike says, was a retooled Templar order, one of many, but I think the most successful retooled Jesuit order was that. You also had the Order of the Golden Fleece in the Habsburg portion of the empire, which interfaced with the Order of the Garter as the highest British chivalric order. Tony Blair is a member, so is Emperor Hirohito, or was Emperor Hirohito. So their patron saint is Saint John, but not the John of the Bible. I think this is more likely the Gnostic Saint John, as in of the secret apocalypse of John. That John, not the one of the Bible. It's the Gnostic John. You also had the Order of the Hashashins as a Muslim Gnostic chivalric order of Batinias. The Batinias were those who carried forth kind of a Muslim Kabbalism, a secret oral teaching that was embedded with black magic, Chaldean kind of magic, coded language and coded teachings for an initiated esoteric inner core. The Order of the Hashashins was founded in 1090, just a few years before the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, and they worked together with the Templars and the Hospitallers over the centuries to make sure that the forever wars between civilizations would continue on and on, occasionally assassinating each other's enemies. Their leader or founder was Hassan-i-Sabah. Hassan-i-Sabah was a Batinia missionary spreading the secret teaching method, and founded this thing in order to create basically assassins by providing a lot of drugs, a technique of brainwashing, utilizing sacred prostitutes, a lot of hedonism in these special little sort of cult centers that young men would sometimes find themselves awakened after being put on a little quest. You know, there's a certain mystique and an allure for secret knowledge, kind of proto-Rosicrucian, and some young men, often of royal families, not always, would be tapped on the shoulder, would be told, hey, you qualify, you've got the right stuff, you got what it takes. You want to go on a quest? Here's a quest. and they would be given a challenge, and they'd have to do it. And if they did it well, if they survived, they would be given another challenge, and another, and another. And kind of like the Wagnerian, stories, or the Wagnerian operas and themes. If they passed through all of their quests, their challenges, and survived, then they would be given, let's say, a cocktail to drink as a reward, and they would pass out. They would go on a bit of a hallucinogenic frenzy. They would pass out and wake up after a mystical experience that was given to them in a controlled way. And they would wake up in this Garden of Eden with these sacred prostitutes willing to give them anything that they wanted, and they could have the food and the drugs and whatever, and they would just be in bliss for a period, a few months, maybe longer, maybe shorter at different times, depending on the person. And at a certain moment, they were given a message saying, okay, you now have a mission to do. If you want to come back, be reincarnated back into this garden of Elysium, this land of 72 virgins. If you want to be reincarnated back into this land of bliss, of hedonism, you have to do the job that is assigned to you by God. And God might want you to go and assassinate a military leader. You might want to assassinate somebody. That's actually always what they wanted you to do. And you'd have to do it, and you wouldn't be allowed to survive. If you survived, you would never be allowed back in the Garden of Eden. So you had to make sure that you got killed after you killed your target. Sometimes they were unsuccessful and got caught. And sometimes, as has been recorded in a few instances, they under torture, they were able to give evidence over what they were doing. And that's what we know about the Order of the Assassins, which still exists in a different name today. So all of this was going on, right? This is a bubbling cauldron of mystery cults, of black magic, of chivalric orders acting Christian on the surface, acting Muslim on the surface, but actually being into ritual war and bloodbath for the purpose of human sacrifice. They were anathema to the idea that cultures could live and work in brotherhood and together in cooperation around things like the Silk Road as a philosophical idea. They were existentially in opposition to this. So what was done? The vitriol against Khazaria, the effort to wipe out all existence of it, all we have are some recordings of Muslim scholars who lived during that time, as I cited a couple today. We have more recently in the 70s was discovered the Cairo Geniza, thousands of scrolls in an abandoned synagogue that was discovered by somebody, and so we have some scrolls that did date back to Khazaria that do feature some records, some transactional records of activity of what was going on. Most of it is like letters of recommendation for a job and stuff, but there are some good philosophical trees in there too that do give us an insight into the type of culture of Khazaria. But what did you get? You had such a crackdown, such a revenge on the Jews as a movement. Venice was the first. In 945, Venice launched the anti-Jewish laws, which were then soon followed by Rome, England, other parts of Europe. In Venice, no ship carrying any Jews was admissible. In England, you had a variety of laws peaking with the Aziz laws, saying that no Jews could own weapons, no Jew could join any military, no Jew could participate in farming and agriculture, no Jew could be a member of a guild, a trade. None could own land. They couldn't. So the former Jews that had maybe, let's say, a knowledge of trades, of paper making or textiles or whatever, were banned from doing what they did. Right? They couldn't do carpentry. They couldn't do blacksmithing. They couldn't be weavers or dyers. So what they were allowed to do was trade in used cloth, and they were allowed to do, or at least selected members from among them were allowed to do accounting and usury. So they were allowed to manage money for overlords who were nominally Christian, but were not allowed to do usury because the papacy had passed a papal bull years earlier saying that Christendom would not permit usury. the lending with predatory interests. Same thing for the Muslim world. So, but it had to be done. Empires, the Templars that ran the global banking operations, still needed to do usury as part of the package of what is required to maintain an empire. You got to do economic warfare, but you can't do it and still call yourself a Christian. So what do? You recruit. You absorb from among the abused Khazarian, now expat, Khazarian peoples who are floating around. You can absorb from amongst the Sephardic Jewish population of North Africa, of Spain. You could absorb and initiate them to be the enforcers of banking, of financial warfare. They could be the money managers because they can't do much else anyway. And for those who do it well, who do it without conscience, who might be more willing to embrace an esoteric type of Kabbalistic teaching, let's say the followers of Zohar, or the followers of the idea of a tree of life and a tree of death, most importantly. The tree of death was very important for those who would be given real power. The Frankists, what would become later on the Frankists, or the Sabbateans later on, these types of like dark Kabbalistic sects within the Jewish cultural matrix would then be useful to create a satanic brew, a satanic breed and tradition of golem within the Jewish world that would then be assigned to and rewarded to carry out brutal economic warfare against victim populations. So again, just to continue on, they were iced out of normal jobs. They were iced out of normal society. In Venice, you had the creation of the ghettos. That's actually a Venetian word, the ghetto, that would isolate the Jews in certain areas that made them more tribal, right? That forced them to wear certain emblems that might have had nothing to do with Judaism to begin with, like the Star of David, which doesn't exist anywhere. And rabbis today have to admit that the Star of David is not even in the Jewish Bible. There's no historic basis around which the particular imagery of today's Star of David has any connection to Judaism. What it does is it does have a connection to Babylon. It does have certain occult significance of a male-female fusion, which has different androgynous and other sexual rights associated therewith, as the Templars were revealed to have been engaged in. But it doesn't really have anything to with the Jewish people per se. So that's a very strange anomaly that is floating there. I'll just leave it float there for a bit. From the 10th to 11th centuries, east-west trade routes became dominated by Genoa and Venetian silk and Venice as the Silk Road collapses. I mentioned the Crusades. I mentioned the Templars. Jewish Radhanite Silk Road routes were taken over and crackdown. So this is from a book called I'm forgetting the name of the book, but I have it cited in my book and in my essay on the Göktürk Kingdom and Khazaria. Yeah, I'll just read it. It's from a really fantastic Jewish scholar, and I can't remember all of a sudden his name, and I didn't put it in my slide. That was stupid of me, but then I'll just read it anyway. The situation would have been an impossible one but for the presence of the Jew, who, precisely as he found himself excluded from other method of gaining livelihood, was forced into this most unhonored profession. The non-Jewish capitalists lent to kings and magnates under the cover of various devices, such as making out the bond for a larger amount than the sum lent, or euphemistically calling the interest by some another name. The more open, least lucrative, and most unpopular branches of the profession, such as lending on pledge for a short period to the artisan and tradesman, were forced upon the Jews. Kind of like, again, the Jewish tax collectors of the Roman Empire, who would do the dirty work and receive the hate and anger of the masses. So too were they again employed once more during the medieval ages and a little afterwards to do the same thing. In Venice, for example, down to the close of the 18th century, the Jewish community was only tolerated on the express condition that it maintains in the ghetto 4 loan banks, or a more polite term for pawnbroking establishments. The only other professions legally permitted there were old cloth stealing and the wholesale export trade to the Levant, which did not compete with Christian traders. The same was the case in the cities of the terra firma, that is the mainland. This ignominious condition of affairs was sternly enforced, and any attempt on the part of the Jews to broaden their economic status or to place it on a slightly more dignified plane was systematically blocked. And again, here's a bunch of hiling knights of the Ku Klux Klan saying goodbye to you, and a little ritual mass of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre today on a Good Friday. So that is my presentation. That is my core presentation completed. And I'm going to now just quickly scan through ever so briefly the comments section. I know I've gone over my allotted time of usually an hour and a half, but it's an important topic, so I wanted to keep it going. And I know people can jump over to Gordon's show, which is, I think it just began 10 minutes ago as they wish. So I'm just going to quickly scan through some things here. And before I do anything, let's listen to the very last ad for today's show, which is, I believe, Back to School. Here we are.
Soft Disclosure deodorant is made with purity-tested ingredients like organic arrowroot powder, magnesium hydroxide, and nourishing plant oils. This deodorant keeps you fresh without covering up the truth. Activated charcoal works like a magnet to help draw out impurities, while green matcha tea brings antioxidant power to protect and calm skin. Aluminum-free, stain-free, and formulated to last up to 2 months of daily use.
Whole bus fresh, no steak on me. Soft Disclosure got me clean. Fresh so loud, can't compete. Mint, lemon, grapefruit, lavender tea.
It helps fight odor without blocking the body's natural sweat. And every purchase helps support 6 American small businesses. Buy 2 deodorants, get a free lip balm. Or visit softdisclosure.com and use promo code FRESH for 15% off.
What are you doing?
Soft Disclosure got me clean. Fresh so loud, can't compete.
All right. So, as promised here, I've just scanned through and I noticed that there's a super chat here, which I don't know if this is the only one. I think it is. So I'll just read it here. From Out of Here says, would you do a show getting into what families you believe to be at the top? Nobody ever does. I can get why and why you may not want to. Just curious. Yeah, sure. And I think I might even bring Mike King back on for that conversation. For those who haven't seen, again, last week's show with Mike King, I simply called it The Jews, although it's clearly so much more than that. Mike has done some of the best work on just mapping out both the families and also the chivalric knighthoods that coexist with these core family lineages. Personally, I don't always know how useful it is, because I know a lot of people really want a list. They want a list just to know, like, who do I knock off to make all the bad things go away. And it's just the wrong way of thinking, because it's really, our problems are cultural. And I would say, if we didn't have this particular list of families based upon the type of cultural mediocrity we've tempered and adapted to, we'd probably be foolish enough to fall for the same kinds of sophistry to get ourselves back into the same type of shitstorm we currently find ourselves in. So it's really this cultural fight that people need to, I think, focus on much, 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 much more in this question of, like, cultivating real wisdom. But of course, we can definitely do it. We can definitely do a show just mapping out some of the core families. We could talk about the Massimo family. We could talk about the Orsinis. We could talk about, the Estes and some of the other hierarchical families. Some things you could do as an exercise, if you want, is just look at the royal houses of European nobility. That's one way to do it, actually. It's not... But at the same time as I say that, it's like, in my view, by and large, the noble families, of which there is a limited array, they're not the basis upon which this evil system really works. It's like, it needs them. It needs the bloodlines, or it's chosen to use the bloodlines, I should say it that way, to extract leadership from amongst a certain limited pool of those who would be qualified or deemed qualified to be inducted into a governing class. But oftentimes you get the Prince Andrews. Oftentimes you get the nobility born into these families who are kind of drinking from the cesspool, dropping ecstasy on Rothschild yachts, going to, Epstein parties. They're not really the type of personalities that you would expect would be responsible enough to manage the complexity of ideological control mechanisms and banking and everything else that goes into controlling top-down systems ritualistically. So it's really, the institution of the families is kind of like an organizing principle, the passing on of fondi, family funds, family inheritance, properties, castles, things like that, managed by certain trusts, managed by certain committees, is part of the organizing principle, but it's not the thing that makes it really work. So, we can go through some of the known families. They don't even hide it. A lot of them even have social media accounts. We could connect that to some of the leading subtle chivalric orders that I think are controlling and tempering many of the worst aspects of secret societies internationally. We can do that. But there's something more going on. And unless we get at that deeper something, it won't really be that useful. But yeah, to make it a long answer short, yes, sure, we can do that. All right, let's look at another question here. Charlemagne was completely under the thumb of the Vatican, says Drum. Well, I hope, Drum, you... I guess you said that before or you wrote that before I commented about Charlemagne's getting tricked into becoming a Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, and his efforts to avoid that fate, and his efforts to bypass the traps of the Vatican. I hope you have taken what I said there into consideration, because it's more complicated. Okay, that's probably something else. Drum has a follow-up point there. Okay, I think that's just Khazarian banks. What do you got here? Drum is very active. The Templars and Hospitallers, Knights of Malta later, were sworn enemies from the time of the Crusades. Yeah, no, yes and no. From a bottom up standpoint, it appears as though they are. They are rivals. There was even like Templar versus Hospitaller wars that actually took the place of, there were the wars of Venice and Genoa. So it's like saying Venice and Genoa were enemies, sworn enemies. Nah, no. There was a certain gangland style vying for jurisdictional influence that animated the four Venetian Genoese wars. And during those Venetian Genoese wars, you'll find that the Templars were always allied with Venice. A lot of it took place in the Holy Land, but also some of it took place on mainland Europe. And the Hospitallers were always allied with Genoa. Both Venice and Genoa were sister maritime empires that both had systems of doges. They both had secretive deep states baked into their systems of control. They both had ruling members of the old Roman patrician class that occupied the governing systems of both of their rival empires. But ultimately, they had common agreements to manage the world under a certain set of rules that would protect the ultimate higher families, who were more often than not working together, while the lower order aspects of the empire would fight with each other. It was the age of empires in a sense, right? There was a Dutch versus English battle that went on for a period, as different factions of the aristocracy were basically looking at the world like a big sick game, a game that involved using the pawns, the chess pieces, basically human beings, as disposable entities to vie over who was going to be the prima inter pares. But there was no real rivalry in that sense. And I think at the end of the day, from the inner sanctum, the upper echelons of the esoteric intersection of the Templars and the Hospitallers, you'll find a communion always, which is also why the Hospitallers were in so many ways the recipients of so much of the power and wealth and membership of the Knights Templar after the Templars were taken down in 1314. So that's an important aspect of that. Let's just quickly scan back to our comment section here, just to see if there's anything more that might have been missed. Here, I'll go to new comments, and then I should probably end this thing. Okay, this person Mooney is really hyperactive. I don't know what's going on there. Again, Drum seems to be the only person really posing any questions or making comments, but the attempt to fuse Templars and Hospitallers was outrightly turned down by Dumoulin. Yeah, Dumoulin was taken down. That is true. Dumoulin was taken down by Philip IV and some leading figures that I've written about. In fact, if people do want to know a lot more about this, I suggest my Revenge of the Mystery Cults trilogy of books goes into a lot of detail, as does Black Sun Rising, the esoteric Nazism past and present, which I recently published with Cynthia and featuring a chapter by Mike King. There's a big section in there on the takedown of the Templars. No, Dumoulin didn't like the fusion of the Templars and the Hospitallers, which was largely an idea by what's his name? Raymond Lull, an incredible scientist, statesman, philosopher who I have come to adore the more I've read the writings of Raymond Lull and his scientific works and their influence on really catalyzing what would become the golden renaissance of Europe and the wave of discoveries of universal principles in the centuries after Lull's life. Lull was a strategist of such a high renown who worked very hard to alchemically, you could say it this way, alchemically transmute the Crusades and the crusading ideology into something founded upon philosopher kings learning and carrying out battles of ideas instead of battles based on killing for Jesus. So Raymond Lull is a factor in this thing. He was an advisor to Philip IV, as well as Edward II, the King of England, and son-in-law of Philip IV, who also played a big role in taking down the English foundations of the Templars, which would later come back under the Order of the Garter. And yeah, Dumoulin didn't like that. That's true. Here. All right. So I think we've gone through a lot today. Yeah, I think I've gone through enough. So if people want, like I said, to review this material in greater detail, go to the comment section, or under my name, you'll find here on the screen, there's matthewehret.substack.com. There's also canadianpatriot.org, and you will find a lot of material, a lot of documentaries, a lot of resources that are available to you, books as well, that go into this in a lot of detail. Somebody writes, wouldn't you agree that the esoteric duality paradigm has been in full swing since Eve ate the fruit? It is in everything. That's a whole show if you want to get it. The use of esoteric dualism and Manichaeanism and its influence within Gnostic theology and politics and its influence within institutional religion. Yeah, we can bring that in. But I think for today, we've done quite a bit. So I will let you all go. And next week, same time, we're going to tackle yet another psyop that we will break free of. Take care, everybody.